So apparently you guys want me to talk about the Sands of Time series some more. A little while ago, I did a defensive rant on Prince of Persia Warrior Within, in which I said that it was an amazing game, so shut up. Surprisingly, everyone who thought it was great kept quiet in my little corner of the world, and for once, I got to know what it felt like when my audience agrees with me on something. Fucking pop the champagne. However, after careful consideration, I realised that I only talked about Warrior Within and Sands of Time in that video. Also, I might have given the impression that I found Sands of Time to be a bit shit, and I want to go on record and say that... well, I don't really care if anyone thinks I hate it, but the truth is that I love that game too. But there was another game in the trilogy that I failed to talk about. In fact, I can't even remember if I gave it a mention, but I don't want to seem like the kind of person who spoils only some of his non-existent children, and not all of them. So this video is going to be a second half to the Warrior Within rant, where I rant entirely about the third game in the series called Two Thrones. Prince of Persia: Two Thrones was released worldwide in December of 2005 and was met with positive welcome. Set around a few weeks, or maybe a month, basically however long it takes to get by boat from the island of Time to Babylon, the prince and his new bit on the side arrive back home with the hopes of putting everything that's happened behind them and settling down. Having said that, I'd love to have seen the prince introduce Kylena to his father. Yes, this is my new girlfriend. She's an empress without an empire, famous for creating a world-destroying weapon that doesn't exist in this timeline due to a technicality, and she's hundreds of years old because I pulled her here from the past. By the way, we did it on the boat on the way here, so don't be surprised if the family suddenly expands 9 months from now. Unfortunately, none of this happens, for upon returning to his home city, the prince is shocked to find that a load of bastards have shown up, informing the Persians that all their base are belong to them, and now the city is currently undergoing a good old-fashioned full rape and pillage session. The prince resolves himself to do something about this, but before even reaching the coast, his boat is attacked by siege engines and he gets washed up ashore. Upon awakening, he finds that his new girlfriend has been kidnapped by those bastards and is being taken somewhere, and because he doesn't approve of polygamy, the prince chases after her. But after catching up, he learns that this army of bastards is being led by the same bad guy from Sands of Time, who we killed at the end of that game, but if you think about it, because the prince prevented the Sands of Time from being created in Warrior Within, then that means that Sands of Time never even happened, so technically you've never killed this guy. So here you are, both yourself and your hot piece of arse from the past, captured by a dude who you've technically killed once before. He says that he's been looking for the Empress for a while, and what a stroke of plot convenience it is that he should just so happen to find her right at the start of the game. He jams a dagger of time into her stomach, she turns into sand, don't ask, and this releases the Sands of Time once more. With the Sands of Time unleashed once again, meaning that your story has now come full circle, meaning in turn that everything you did in the past 2 games was a complete waste of time, unless you count the 6-week sex marathon you just had in the Love Boat before this game opens up. Everyone present, including the Vizier, his captains, and your arm, become corrupted by the power of the sands. Only you are able to escape from being turned instantly into a sand monster, however you do not get away from it unscathed. Deep within your subconscious, something dark has awoken. An evil, impulsive version of the prince now begins to whisper in your ear, gaining power all the while, and after enough time has passed, the prince suddenly finds himself transforming into a sand monster known as the Dark Prince. The effects are only temporary, and entering water turns him back, but now the prince is on the clock to save the world once more, before the darkness within him ultimately takes control. That's the premise, now on to the unstructured ramblings that you've all come to expect from me. I personally love the addition of the Dark Prince to this game. There's a very clear and in-your-face psychological aspect to this game that really sinks its hooks into you. The Dark Prince is quite obviously a bad guy, and he's specifically a threat to you. Yet there are many times where he'll offer you helpful suggestions, and his combat abilities are very welcome during tough encounters. The game encourages you to distrust this character, yet at the same time, you can't imagine what it's like not having him there. There are certain sections of this game that simply cannot be completed unless you are the Dark Prince. And don't get me wrong, you don't get the choice of whether you are the Dark Prince or not, you end up transforming and de-transforming in cutscenes, but when going through some of the Dark Prince's areas, it soon becomes apparent that you'd never be able to get through these parts if you were still your normal Persian self. This is partly thanks to the new tail whip weapon that you've acquired, which is embedded into your arm, and Christ it looks painful, and I'm surprised the prince never tries to pull it out. But with it, you can latch onto certain ledges and ornaments to overcome certain obstacles. It also made the combat fun to watch, as there were several sweet looking combos that you could pull off with it. All failing that, you could be a boring fart and just mash its main attack button and kill everything around you without a single enemy ever getting close to you. This is probably my only criticism of this feature, in that it kind of encourages you to not try out any of the other moves when you consider that mashing the main attack button with it will do the job just as well. But despite sounding really overpowered and badass, the Dark Prince does have one major drawback. All the while you are in this form, you are constantly, though slowly, losing health. And there are no water sources around for you to regain health. The only way to replace lost health is to find sand clusters nearby, which are usually hidden in breakable objects or are dropped by defeated enemies. This creates an interesting sense of urgency within us, as now we've got to complete several puzzles and defeat many enemies before our health runs out. But hold on a second, doesn't this sound familiar? Playing as a darker version of ourselves, where our health is constantly draining and we're required to complete puzzles and defeat enemies quickly? Yep, it's been done before in Warrior Within. Remember the Sand Wraith section? Well, imagine that, but where the combat is a bit more exciting. The Sand Wraith section of Warrior Within was... well, I didn't really care for the Sand Wraith section. It was such a Deus Ex Machina solution to the problem. The prince finds out that he's f***ed everything up, and now that he's going to die, he's all like, damn, if only there was a way I could work outside the rules of fate. And then he immediately fucking trips over the solution and becomes a Sand Wraith. Yeah, I think that might have been the worst part of Warrior Within for me. As much as I love the bones off of that game, the Sand Wraith section was so contrived and forced in. It felt like the devs had come up with a cool idea, but couldn't really find a story-friendly excuse to include it in Warrior Within, so they ended up just stapling it in 2/3 of the way through like an out-of-place DLC that they decided to put in anyway. But I am proud to say that this time round, they made a good reason for it to be included in the game. The Dark Prince's story arc is a very important element to the overall story. What you have to remember is that despite Sands of Time not happening, and Warrior Within not being recorded in the history books, the prince himself has gone through all of that and more. The events of Sands of Time, 7 years of evading the Dahaka, the events of Warrior Within, which includes events from 2 time periods, and finally returning home only to find it slashed and burnt, and now to add insult to injury, the prince has a sand monster inside of him that's trying to take over. To put all of this bluntly, the prince needs a day off. He has been through so much, but has become stronger as a result. A lesser man would have been destroyed by all of this, but not the prince. And no longer is he an honour and glory hunter. He has found out the hard way of where that gets you. The Dark Prince, on the other hand, spends most of the game trying to undermine this. He'll encourage the prince to think only about himself, to give in to the temptation of reverting back time and avoid taking responsibility, like he has done in the past. Or doing whatever you want to do, rather than doing the right thing. Now, some of you may be seeing a connection between elements of this game and Sands of Time setting. That being a Persian city that's being overrun with the Sands of Time, all of which is being orchestrated by the same villain while we wield the Dagger of Time in an attempt to correct what has happened. Damn, let's just hope that Farah doesn't show up. Oh, and there she is, ladies and gentlemen! Now, there's a reason why this game seems so familiar to that of Sands of Time, and that's because it's supposed to mirror it. Sands of Time never happens during this point in the timeline, and so, because history repeats itself, we're finding that many similar scenarios that happened in Sands of Time are happening again. But though a lot of people love this game for it, there's still this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Let me explain. If you remembered my Warrior Within rant, I talked about how one of the biggest criticisms that that game saw was that Warrior Within's atmosphere was nowhere near to that of Sands of Time's. Many people said that what made Sands of Time charming had been discarded in favour of a more darker tone. I then went on to say how all those people can kindly go shaft themselves, as that's a pretty weak argument to make. But when I played Two Thrones for the first time, and picked up on the obvious Sands of Time similarities, my first reaction was, oh god, I hope Ubisoft didn't pander to those people. Sands of Time was awesome because it was its own thing. Warrior Within was awesome because it took what worked from Sands of Time and Brave New Grounds. Two Thrones, in some respects, Brave New Grounds again, sometimes to its own benefits, such as the Dark Prince and the boss fights, of which we'll get to soon, and sometimes not to its own benefit, such as the chariot chase scenes, which acted as a pointless and stiff version of Need for Speed. Like, seriously, we've had the sex scene, heavy metal, and now we've got a car chase. All this series is missing is Vin Diesel, and we've got another Fast and Furious film in the making. Or speed killing, which I'll also get to later on. However, to this day, I can't shake the feeling that the plots may have been written as it was in order to avoid further flack from fans over the series not being like Sands of Time. If it was written as such in order to demonstrate the history repeats itself, then Two Thrones gets a nice big thumbs up from me. If, however, this is not the case, and the plot was only written as such in order to not piss off its own fans, then all I can say is shame. But enough of that, let's talk about more cool things. The bosses in this game are certainly worth a mention as well. Though personally, I miss how the boss fights were done in Warrior Within, in which it's a standard one-on-one fight based purely on the combat mechanics. Two Thrones understands that this series is all about both environmental puzzles and combat, and so it attempts to bring the two together during boss fights. The first guy you fight in the arena, for example, well, for one, holy shit. But in order to do some actual damage to him, you cut up at his cankles a bit, but then you've got a free run over some obstacles before taking a stab at his eyes, if you pardon the pun. And though this is a bit of a stretch in saying this, and don't worry, I certainly don't class these two games under the same category, but this style of boss fight does somewhat remind me of Shadow of the Colossus, in which the boss fight is both a fight and a puzzle, and I thought that was a really good idea to bring over to the series. And now for the negative part. Firstly, 2 words. Speed kills. Or perhaps there's a dash between the 2 words, whatever. I think this part was hit and miss. Some people really liked this mechanic and thought that it added this new level of tension to the combat, whilst others saw it for what it was. That is, quick time events. I'm not the biggest fan of quick time events, and that's mainly because they're usually poorly implemented, resulting in an insta-death purely because you don't have the reflexes or attention span of the Flash. We're video gamers! Of course we have short attention spans. If a game isn't asking us to kill something or solve something within the first few minutes of opening, then we get bored. Sometimes quick time events are done pretty well, such as in Star Wars The Force Unleashed 1, whilst other times it's poorly implemented. See Resident Evil 4. But if we were to put Star Wars down as a 10 and Resident Evil 4 as a 1, then on the same scale, I'd probably say that Two Thrones' speed kill mechanic comes in at around 7. There are far worse examples of quick time events than here, and if you do fuck up a speed kill, then you'll just have to do the fight as you normally would, so there's no real penalty for screwing this up, aside from the monsters calling in reinforcements. However, the game actively encourages you to do it. Being able to speed kill does exactly that. Kill a group of enemies very quickly, and it works well enough. However, I'd say that when considering what this mechanic offers to the overall experience of this game, then speed killing can f*** right off. As said, Prince of Persia's gameplay consists of 2 elements, puzzles and combat. But if you're trying to go for the speed kills, then you're basically saying that you don't want to fight anyone. Then why are you playing this game? Prince of Persia 2 Thrones has a perfectly good combat system in place anyway, but I just can't understand why the devs felt the need to give us the option of skipping it. Sure, you can't speed kill every encounter, but firstly, it's not a game changer, and secondly, it's giving us the option of not enjoying a core element of gameplay. Even some of the bosses, despite being really cool encounters, require you to undergo a speed kill segment, and failing it means that you'll have to start the whole process again. To which I call bollocks! It means I'm getting penalised, not based on how good I am in combat, but on how quickly I can press one button. It blows my mind that this game is prioritising quick-time events over its more than adequate combat. But on another note, and let me be honest with you here, I didn't really like Farah that much. What the fuck? I found it a little strange in Sands of Time that she clearly had the hots for the prince so soon after she had lost her home, her family, and the world was about to be destroyed. It kind of felt like she had her priorities round the wrong way, or that she wasn't really taking the situation all that seriously. You'd be busy working on a puzzle while she just stands there reading books and telling you how important the power of love is, and you know what? What I'm trying to do here is pretty important as well, love, so why not put the book down for a moment and give us a hand, yeah? And as mentioned in my Warrior Within video, she was terrible in combat to the point where she just made things worse. Thankfully, she's much better this time round, and that's in no small part to her hardly having a presence in battle. Farah shows up in cutscenes, as well as some of the puzzles, and is a little more hands-on this time than before, but despite looking a bit more of a tomboy than the Farah that we all know and sort of but probably don't love from Sands of Time, she doesn't really get involved in combat. Which is fine by me. Though I'd say it'd help if she wasn't in too many of the cutscenes either. I'm really sorry for saying this, but I've always found her to be completely dull, and none more so than in Two Thrones. In one scene, you're riding an elevator with her, medieval Persia I know, but don't ask. During this cutscene, she tries to get to know you by asking you what your favourite colour is. Really? That's the best pickup line you've got? You might as well have asked me if I come here often. What a terrible chat-up line! You couldn't think of anything better than, what is your favourite colour? And is it me, or is this scene turning into Monty Python's Holy Grail? What happens if I get it wrong? Do I get thrown out the elevator? To be fair, the prince makes it worse by asking her what her favourite food is, which isn't a bad question, though it is a little on the safe side. However, Farah answers, the pomegranate. Oh my god, what a boring answer! And her reason for why is so boring as well. She likes them because they're difficult to eat. A live alligator is difficult to eat, but at least that sounds interesting. This scene would have stayed with me for all the right reasons had she said something like honey dipped possum or, I don't know, molested goose. I can't believe I just said that, and I'm a vegetarian. This game ended the best way it could have as well. I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't played it, but you get your happy ending, and it finishes with how the entire series began. It wraps everything up nicely with the prince getting together, presumably, with Farah at the end, and the prince not caring that he's now seen his father die twice and his last girlfriend getting shanked and turned into a ghost that's made of sand. Don't think too hard on that either. It finishes up with barely any questions left unanswered, and the entire franchise put to bed. And that was the Sands of Time trilogy. All three games were seen to be highly successful, and there was never any need for Ubisoft to go back and add another game into the timeline. I don't know, maybe some other time. In conclusion, this game was, and still is, very good. It's aged quite well, and will still give those players of old and new a lot of enjoyment. But honestly, despite not wanting to end on a bad note, I'd probably say that this game is my least favourite in the trilogy, but that's only a testament to how much I like the other two. Don't let that put you off of this title though, as it's still worth playing. It has a great story, an awesome setting, and its combat and boss fights are memorable. However, it experiments with the gameplay a little, and much like a blind man in a public toilet, the results of it is going to be hit and miss.
Below.